In this lesson, we're going to have a lot of fun with functions. So I'm going to show you the different types of functions that you can set up, including function declarations, as well as function expressions. And I'll show you how you can use those, as well as how the scope works for the function values, where we can set variable names and use those values and variables within the function scope, that's within the curly brackets of the function. How we can also pass in arguments into the function, use those values within the function, and make calculations and results, and even return back those results back to the original statement that was invoking the function, and then use those within the code and outputting the results into the console. So that's all coming up in this lesson. Create a new JS file. I'm calling it app3.js. So this is just a blank JS file where we're going to be showing you how you can use some functions. And functions, what they do is they allow us to run blocks of code. So whereas before, if we want to make some updates, so if we set a value and then we make an update to the value of a counter starting at a value of 0 by 1, more than once within the code, then we can set that up within the function. So that includes that if we want to output it into the console, and if we want to output the counter into the console as well. So let's run the code as it is right now. So it added the last name and incremented the counter by 1. There's also a shorthand method to increment the counter, so we don't have to always have the equal plus and have the counter name. So if we're just reassigning a new value and incrementing it by 1, we can also assign the value and just doing a +1. And there's also even a shorter format. If it's just 1 that we're adding, we can do a ++, and that will increment the counter by 1. So let's wrap this code within a function, and then we'll call to the function. There's two types of functions. There's a function declaration and a function expression. Function expressions are very similar to what we saw with variables, where we're assigning a value and assigning it to a value of function. And then within the curly brackets, this is the set of code that we want to run. So this is what's known as a function expression, where we're assigning the function to the variable called fun1. And now when we refresh the code, we can output fun1 into the console, and that's going to return back the entire function. So with functions, we need to run the code, and that we can do with the rounded brackets. So with the parentheses, and that allows us to run the code where it's running the code and outputting it. And as you can see, we ran it several times here within the console. So it continued to increment the counter by 1, added the last name to the variable, to the original variable, and continued to make those increments, and then outputted all of those values into the console. So just as we did within the console, in order to invoke the function, we need to set the function, and then within the code, we can invoke the function using the rounded brackets. And if we want to invoke it multiple times within the code, we can run it as many times as required. So let's add that and run the code. So now we get the console messages, and what's happening here is that it's running the fun1 block of code. Because it's in the function, we can request to run the block of code at any time. There is a difference between the function expression, which is the one that we just used, and the function declaration. So if you try to invoke the function before you've written the function expression, you're going to throw an error where fun1 cannot be run before it's initialized. So you do need to set the function before you try to run it. With the function declaration, so the format is going to be slightly different, where we start out with the keyword called function, and then we have the function name. So in this case, we'll call it fun2. And then we have the block of code with the content that's contained within it. So we'll run the same block of code within fun2. And instead of requesting to fun1, we'll request to fun2 to invoke the function fun2. And with the function declarations, you can invoke the code before you've made the declaration, and it will still work and still output the content. Functions have their own scope for the variables. So right now what we were doing is we were using the global variables. And when we mention global variables, that means that because they are within the parent scope, so they're outside of any of the blocks of code where we've got the curly brackets, that they're going to be accessible by all of the code that's within contained within that parent scope. So this is the main scope where we've been writing the code so far, but we have different scopes that we can set up. And now that we're using functions, we can set up scope within the curly brackets. So what that means is that if we set up a function, and I'll just call this fun3, and we have a variable that we want to use val as well, and we set a value for val, and then we console log out the value of val. Let's invoke the function. So invoke function3, and we'll see what we get for the result. So we're outputting a value of val of Svekis, and now when we look at the value of val, it has been changed to Svekis. So it's been updated from Laurence to Svekis. But if I take the value of val and if I assign a variable val to Svekis, and I console log out val before and after we run fun3, you're going to see that the value of val within the function fun3 is going to be Svekis, but outside it's going to be still using that original value when we were running the functions and assigning it to that global variable. So if we declare a variable within the function scope, which is within the curly brackets, that means that this variable is only going to be living within the function and we can't access it outside of the function. So if we created a variable and we assigned a value to it, and then we run fun3 and we try to access the value of val1, we're not going to be able to access it. We're going to throw an error because outside of the function, there's no reference for this variable. If the code does have a variable that isn't declared, it will move to the parent scope, so the parent that's sitting outside of the block of code, in order to try to find a reference for that variable. But it won't move into the blocks of code in order to find the reference. So that's why we're going to throw an error when we try to assign a variable or access a variable that's only been declared within the function. Within a function as well, we can pass in arguments, and those are values that can be used specifically within the function. So let's create another function using the keyword function, and this one could just be called fun4. And we're going to have some parameters, so having them as value a, b, and c. So these are parameters, or they're going to be arguments when they are passed in as values into the function. And within the function itself, we can make use of these values. So let's log them out within the console. So that will be a, b, and c, and run the function. So we've got fun4, and we need to pass in arguments as those values. So let's just pass them in as some numbers, and we'll see what we get for the result when we refresh it. So we just get those values being output, and those values are now only going to be referenced as a, b, and c within this particular block of code within this function called fun4. Let's do something with those values where we're going to take the value of, we'll declare another variable, and we'll take a plus b times c, and that will be the result that we're going to be outputting for val. And we'll refresh, so that gives us a total there, and that means that every time we run the function, if we have different values that we're sending into the function, the result is going to be different. So we're going to always return back a different value once we run the block of code within the function. And this shows you some of the power of functions, because it really allows you to repeat certain actions, and you can have different values that are coming in. You can also return back values for functions. So creating another function, we'll call this fun5, and this one will have the 3 parameters once again, and we'll take those values. So let's declare a value of val, and we'll just multiply them all together. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to return back the value of val. So we'll return back the final value. We're not going to output it into the console, but we'll return back the value. So let's run fun5. We'll pass in some values into it. And when we run it, we're not getting any output yet, so we're not returning back a value for it. So let's assign the return back response to a variable, and maybe we can just call it output. And then within the console, we'll output into the console. So now we're getting the result being returned back, where we're passing in some values as a, b, and c. We're multiplying them within the function, and then lastly, we're returning back the result of that value within the function, and that returned result is going to be assigned to the variable called output, and then the variable output now has a value of 224 that we can use within the rest of the code. So you can see the same thing when you can run the functions directly within the console. So here I'm running the function, I've got the values that I'm passing in, and this is the return back response from the function that we see within the console. And again, this is the one that we're using within the output to output the content. So functions can contain values, and we can also use values that are globally available. So if we want to increment the counter and use that within the function when we're returning back a value, we can also add the value of counter to it, and that's going to affect the result and have a different value that's being returned back. The set of values once again, but this time because we're using the counter, which is incrementing by 1, the results should be different. They should have one increment over the other one. So first value is being returned back as 229, the second value is being returned back as 230, because we can see the value of counter at this point is going to be 6. So every time we run 5, it's going to change the value of counter, and that's going to be affecting that global value of counter that's sitting outside of the function. So before the next lesson, go ahead and try it out. Create some functions, run the functions within your code to get more familiar with how you can pass in values and then return values back from the functions, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson.